today marks the start of our Graduate Friday series, where the PhD candidates of the Hot Politics Lab will present what they're working on. And the presentations last 10 minutes, and then we have 15 minutes Q&A. And so we start with Nikki, who's a PhD candidate at the Research Institute of Child Development and Education here at the University of Amsterdam. And the goal of her PhD is to further disentangle how attitudes and polarization develop and unfold among youth in Amsterdam. And then we have Dan, who is a PhD candidate in political science, and will talk about radical activation, competitive norms, and the rise of the populist radical right. Insert.
Yeah, I'm very honored to speak today. I've been part of the Hot Politics Lab for a year now. I've been working on my PhD for almost a year. And today I'll tell you something about my project on polarization among youth. Yeah, first a short introduction. My PhD is officially in educational sciences. I do have a background in communication science, and I did a research master in political communication. So I've been around here for a while. My project is interdisciplinary. So I do have supervisors from educational sciences, communication science, and psychology, which is very interesting. We have a lot of different perspectives on a topic which also requires different perspectives, in my opinion. The main question, I think, for my project is why youth polarization? Polarization is currently a hot topic. It has been for a few years, and polarization is very widely studied among adults, which is, of course, very important. But when you think about when polarization starts, I think you cannot forget the period of adolescence. And in this case, in my study, adolescence is the age range from 12 to 18. Why is adolescence important? Because the brain of adolescents is still very malleable. And that means that their attitudes and beliefs still change a lot. They're very influential. And that is, if we want to do something about polarization, I think it's very important to also look into adolescence. So I'll tell you something about my two projects that I'm working on. I'm working on two distinct projects at the same time. First of all, I got a secondary data set, which is the ADKS data. It's a Dutch longitudinal study on 6 years. It collects data from 49 different schools, and it's currently still collecting their 6th year of data. And within this huge data set, they also have some information on democratic dilemmas. And I'm looking into polarization on these democratic dilemmas or democratic values. My second project is my own project, like my own data, and I'm trying to develop a measuring instrument for youth polarization. This is simply to capture, or simply it is meant to capture polarization among youth. On what topics is youth polarized, or is there polarization among youth? And I'm currently doing a pilot study for this project. The data collection took place in December, and today marks the last day of my data collection, which is very exciting. I'm measuring both ideological and affective polarization in this study, and eventually I hope to set up a large-scale quantitative youth panel to help, among others, schools and teachers to capture polarization among youth and maybe implement this measuring instrument for example, citizenship education. So first on my first project on democratic dilemmas. The main research question that is underlying this project is, on what democratic issues do we see polarization among Dutch youth? As I said, it's a longitudinal study. It's a 6 year of data collection, but I'm only focusing on the first year for now. Although polarization, we often think of it as something that happens over time, which is of course true, but you can also look at it at a certain time point, which is challenging, and it requires sometimes some arbitrary choices. But It's about differences between groups. In this first year, I look at the first year of secondary school, so 11 to 13-year-olds, and I have a total of 2,390 students, which is quite a lot. I'm looking at these 7 democratic dilemmas, which I'll show to you later. It is measured on a 4-point scale, which is unfortunately not a lot, but it was not my own decision. And I'm using multi-level modeling to look at the effects on individual and class level and maybe school level, but I'm still in the midst of my analysis. So still looking at what variables I want to use and also looking at whether I have enough power to even look at school level. These are the 7 dilemmas. So for example, if you look at dilemma 1, it's I think that you should be able to say whatever you think, even if it hurts others, versus I don't think you should be able to say everything you think because it can hurt other people's feelings. Or another one, 6, for example, the differences between the rich and the poor must be reduced versus the differences between the rich and the poor must be maybe widened. So a slight look into my preliminary results. Don't pin me on this because I'm still working on it, but it gives quite a good insight. I took this dilemma as an example. So I think that the rules of God should be more important than the Dutch law versus I think that the Dutch law should be more important than the rules of God. On the left image, you see the student radicalization scores. It's like an individual polarization measure. So it's what we call radicalization, and it's measured as the deviation from the class mean. So it's about polarization on class level. So here we see the proportion of radicalization scores. And as the item is measured on a 4-point scale, a radicalization score of 0.75, which is quite arbitrary, but I think it's already quite big. You see quite some different scores of radicalization. And on the right image, you see class polarization. So that's the variance within a class. Of course, bimodality is a better measure for polarization, but we're still working on a valid bimodality measurement. So for now, I'm looking at variance in classes, and which is also quite a good proxy for polarization. This is quite the change, but this gives some insight into my multi-level models on this dilemma. So here you see the variables that I use, the predictors on individual level and on classroom level. First, you see some control variables like gender, education level, political interest, importance of religion, migration background, SES. But more interesting, talking politics and society, or the frequency of talking about politics and societal issues with teachers, parents, and friends, and also perceived classroom climate. And on the classroom level, we have some averages on frequency of talking about politics and society, and also the average perceived classroom climate. However, on class level, for this dilemma, we see nothing happening. We do see something happening on the individual level, and it can be expected. The importance of religion is very important for this dilemma. So what does this mean? Whenever importance of religion goes up, so someone finds their religion more important, you see that they are more likely to deviate from the class mean, to have a different opinion from the average student in their class. And then if we look at the frequency of talking about politics and society, also something interesting is going on. You see that both for teachers and for parents, this is significant. And but also interesting, but it also makes sense, the effects are opposite. Although the effects are not very big, you can see that whenever the frequency of talking about politics and society with teachers goes up, students are less likely to deviate from the class mean. So students move towards each other in their attitudes. However, when students talk to their parents about politics and society, they are more likely to deviate from the mean, which makes sense, but it's still interesting to see the opposite effect here. Now it's something about my other project, which is developing the polarization measuring instrument. I collected data on one secondary school, for which I currently have around 500 responses. And the survey contains some statements. So these statements are on broad societal topics, but also on youth-specific topics. We're trying to capture polarization among youth. And if there is polarization, what subjects are youth currently polarized on? These statements can be scored on a 7-point Likert scale. And they're followed by one of the following two randomly. So either an effective item or an importance or salience item, because I, and especially my psychology professor in methods, believe salience is very important for polarization. These are some examples of the statements. They're very simple. They're as simple as possible because these are adolescents. They have to be understandable for 12-year-olds, but also for 18-year-olds. And they're either conservatively or progressively formulated. So the climate crisis is exaggerated, or all toilets in school should be gender neutral. They can score this on a 7-point Likert scale. If they choose to score it neutral, they get a follow-up question, because I believe there are several reasons someone can check the neutral option, which is either I don't have an opinion, or I am neutral. I both agree and disagree with the statement, or I don't understand the statement. It's also meant to stimulate students to think about the statement and to answer it. They do get the instruction that if they don't know the answer, they can check the neutral option. Then the effective item and the importance item. The effective item is related to their friends. So a friend has a different opinion than you about the statement, and they have to say whether they don't mind at all or they think it's very bad on a 4-point scale. And the importance item asks or states, I have a strong opinion on the statement, quote statement, and they disagree or agree. That's it for now. I hope to tell you more soon.
Thank you so much, Nikki. We have about 10 minutes, 15 minutes for questions, and then we'll move over to that.
Thank you. Really interesting. I'm not sure if I've seen this before, the Polarization meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Of it.
Yeah.
One thing I find it super fascinating. However, I struggled a bit, and you didn't really, I think, introduce it. How do you see polarization? In your point, polarization, you said in between binary module.
Yeah.
But you could also think it needs to be far apart. You know, if you're like in the middle of a scale, but you have two, it could also be polarized or not. Others would say, even if you have the same amount of people in each category, it's still polarized. So that's what I'm wondering about on a conceptual level, and also the conceptual level of a dilemma. Because these are, for me, attitudes. And as you said, you have an interdisciplinary approach. So in my discipline, I would not speak of it. So I'm just wondering how and why.
Yeah. So the first part, what is polarization? Well, I think that's, as you mentioned, there are different perspectives on what polarization exactly is. And I've thought about it and decided that for me, polarization is not necessarily about two groups being on the extremes of a scale. It can be, there can be one group in the middle of a scale and one group on the extreme end. Well, I believe polarization is about bimodality, so at least two different groups. If you speak of polarization in the extremes, it's way more uncommon. It doesn't really happen. Already right now, polarization is very difficult to capture among adults. It is also very difficult to capture among youth, and maybe that's a good thing, but still there is a reason we're worrying about it, of course. But I believe polarization is about bimodality, and it doesn't have to be on the extremes. And your question about the dilemmas, I didn't come up with it as a dilemma. It was formulated as that, and I had to work with it. So I do understand where you're coming from, and it's about attitudes. But there are two groups at the same time. So with an opposite belief that kind of goes against the democratic values. So that's, I think, what makes it a dilemma. Do you have an opinion about it? Yeah.
Two things I want.
Mhm.
So I think it only is a dilemma if I want to adhere to God and
Yeah.
democracy. But if I don't care about God,
Yeah.
there's no dilemma for me in this context.
I get it.
But
Yeah.
I also get that this name might have just been given to me.
Yeah.
Because I thought about it and was like,
Yeah.
for me it's more difficult to answer this because it's not a dilemma.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think you can want both sides though, but it doesn't apply to everyone. Yeah.
We have one.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's really interesting. I'm actually also working on socialization myself. So I was wondering, and this is a bit of a mean comment because I think some of the data is there and you cannot change it.
Yeah.
But studying 12 to 13-year-olds is always really challenging. I mean, this is what I know from other people working with that specific data as well. And also, I thought the statements you just showed, they're quite demanding. And I think like expecting from a 12-year-old to have an opinion about Gaza, I mean, expect that from a 25-year-old and you won't get a good answer. I mean, like that is quite challenging. So I was wondering how you deal with if you have a lot of neutral statements, if you don't see like they don't have any opinions formed yet. Also, maybe they will form it when they get older. So if you have enough observations, then also to deal with that problem. And also repeating Rebecca's point that I think an experimental approach would better capture a dilemma. I mean, like notorious conjoints could help there, but to really proper that dilemma situation.
Yeah.
And final point, I was just wanted to give you a literature suggestion. I don't know if you know the work of Christian Fredrickson.
I'm not sure.
Because he actually worked on quite similar stuff. So like dilemmas of democratic perceptions among young people. And
that's a good one.
A recent paper published in BJPS. So
okay.
Maybe that would be interesting for you to look at. And he actually did conjoints in several countries. It might be interesting.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you. Yeah. So coming back to your first point, what was it again?
If they're not too young.
Too young. Yeah.
If they have already formed their habits, beliefs, values, attitudes, and so on.
Yeah. Well, I'm focusing on 12, 13-year-olds for the secondary data only. So the data that I received. But for the data that I'm collecting myself, I'm looking at 12 to 18-year-olds. So I do think that 18-year-olds have an opinion on Israel and Gaza. And we wanted to include it because it was it was a very actual situation when I was starting to collect data, and it feels wrong to not include it. And how do I deal with missings? I don't know yet if they answer neutral. Well, it's interesting to see in itself, right? To see whether they already have an opinion on that if they're very young. Might also be saying something about the extent of or the amount of information they receive from social media, for example. Do you think so too, or?
I just picked an example. It's not like
a
specific item.
Yeah, but the statements
in general are quite demanding.
Yeah.
Adults, right? I mean, like, but
it seems like it, but you cannot have too much nuance when you're trying to capture polarization. It has to be very simple, and we try to keep it as simple as possible, as few words as possible.
Yeah.
And I also did a pilot for the pilot, and I went to the school and we went through the questionnaire, and I wanted to know whether the questions were understandable for every age group. And they all thought it wasn't very hard. They actually thought it was easy and they were done very quickly. So I was actually surprised to see that, but yeah. So I believe it works. And it's also difficult to start from scratch, right? If you have to figure out what works and what doesn't. So if it doesn't work, that's also something I can take and develop further. Yeah.
Marina, have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. I think it's super cool, especially that you're looking at the youth, because I haven't seen much on that. And I'm also super curious, what you're going to find out also when it comes to like educational background of parents, low versus high. And I think that would be super interesting. But my question is on something that I've always struggled with in the realm of polarization. Can you go one slide back? Because that's what triggered the question. And that is on sort of attitude certainty versus polarization. Because especially because the items are so demanding, I would be unsure and like looking at this importance item. Does a strong opinion now mean that my opinion strongly moves towards the end of the opinion spectrum, so strongly against or strongly for it? Or am I just very firm in my idea that I agree to an extent? In polarizing topics like Gaza, for example, I could imagine that people have are certain or firm in their preference for one side, but wouldn't go all the way to the strongly agree or disagree.
Yeah.
Sort of like, how do you handle this? Do you consider it the same? Like, it's a strong opinion. Does it mean a polarized opinion? Does it mean a firm, certain attitude?
Yeah.
It's something that I'm always struggling with in my head. Would children know whether this now means that they have a firm opinion, whether it's now closer to the middle or not?
Yeah.
Or you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, it's a very good point because we've had lots of discussion about this, how to measure importance or salience. It's a very big discussion, and one of my supervisors has conducted a study on this specifically, and they tried to figure out what item measures salience or importance the best. And then this item came out as the best. And in my how we understand it is that even if you're neutral, you can be very sure you are neutral.
Yeah.
So it doesn't say that you're very extreme on a statement, but it basically says that you're very sure about your attitude.
But then if it's I mean, I can also perceive a topic to be super salient, but I'm sure about my opinion. Right?
Yeah.
Like that feels like a third dimension to it almost.
Yeah.
It's so complex. Maybe it's also, I don't know, hard for me to sort of capture the picture, but then I see almost a like agree, disagree dimension. Like where, then how firm are you on your opinion on this particular point on the scale, and how salient is the topic to me? It's like almost.
Yeah, but you mean that you're neutral on a statement and still think a topic is salient?
Yeah, I can be certain that I'm neutral on a salient topic.
Yeah. But they can still, for this questionnaire, they can still answer they're neutral and still say they are very strong about their opinion.
And but then is that issue salience or is that attitude certainty?
How I understand it, it's attitude certainty, but I do get your point, but it's a very, we wanted to include this in the questionnaire, but we'll have to see what it does. So
it might maybe even be interesting to ask of the youth, like especially if you want to develop instruments, like how did you understand this question and sort of break it down into dimensions?
Yeah, that might be a next step.
So complex. So yeah, really cool that you're tackling that.
Trying to.
Well, you are gonna find that.
Yeah, I hope so. We'll see.
Great. So I think that's all the time we have for questions. So thank you again, Nikki, for this great presentation.
Thank you.
So I will be talking about relatively vague ideas of my next experiment. So I'm very open to your insight or recommendations. As most of you know, I'm doing research about, I'm trying to integrate theories in political psychology and political sociology to figure out who and under what circumstances vote for the populist radical right, or PRR. And in my next experiment, I would like to test what sort of social norms may attenuate those effects that I have found in my first two studies. So a bit of context. The rise of the PRR is rooted in the capacity to being able to integrate lower and middle class people in their constituency. So basically, the economic changes during the past decades, mostly global outsourcing, led to the economic status loss of lower class or of working class people, whereas institutionalization of different cultural practices or cultural frameworks like multiculturalism or gender equality led to the subjective status loss of middle class people, mostly white males, but not only. Furthermore, the propagation of individual meritocracy was used not only to dissolve class identities, but also to justify the inequalities as a result of fair competition. So what we can see is that the main root or main driver of PRR voting is rooted in some sort of competition for social status, more specifically some sort of combination of objective status or socioeconomic status, subjective status concern, and status-focused personalities, mostly narcissism, that lie behind PR voting patterns, or that can explain them. So my first two studies, the first one was a correlational study on German data. The second is an experimental study on Dutch data. And in both of them, I found that status threat or status envy is related to PR voting in two ways. There is a lower class pathway or lower class profile that is characterized by a neurotic personality and vulnerable narcissism, as well as with authoritarian attitudes, whereas the middle class is more of a disagreeable personality who are characterized by narcissistic rivalry and xenophobia or supremacy or nativism. So here is the conceptual model. There are two types of narcissism. Both of them are correlated with trait envy. And as these are status-focused personality traits, status concern may trigger state envy or may activate these personality traits, leading to either nativism or authoritarianism that constitute the PRR. And what I'm interested in is this purple arrow. So what sort of social norms may modulate this interaction, or what sort of social norms may attenuate the effect of status concern on status-related personality traits? So what I'm finding in literature is that both envy and narcissism are closely related to competition or competitive norms. Furthermore, authoritarianism is higher in vertical or competitive societies, whereas it's lower in more horizontal, more communal societies. Furthermore, what I also find is that the concept of status itself is different in individualist and vertical societies versus in horizontal and collectivist societies. Because whereas it's more related to, so status and power or control over resources is more or less the same in individualist societies, it's more, the status is more about prosociality in horizontal collectivist societies. So I'm thinking about two types of experiments. One is more of a vignette-based manipulation, and the other one is more an economic behavioral game-based manipulation, but the two may also be combined. So in the first one, what I'm thinking about is priming people with by asking them to think about a situation in their life that primes them either with horizontal / collectivist / cooperative norm, or in the other group a more individualist or vertical or competitive norm. So for one of them, I could use the theory of Trianides, which classifies societies by along 2 dimensions: horizontal, vertical, and collectivist, individualist. And I would compare, so in one group, I would choose rather the vertical individualism norm, which is more of a independent, unequal, competitive norm. For example, with sentences like, describe a situation where you were proud of being better than others. Or in the horizontal collectivist group, which is more interdependent, more equal or egalitarian, and more cooperative. For example, I love cooperating, or to me, pleasure is spending time with others. There is a sort of similar theory, but it's not from cultural psychology, but from cultural anthropology. Fisk classified different human relationships or human interactions to 4 dimensions. And from these, I would pick 2: the communal sharing, which is, for example, I help others without expecting returns. And the other one is the market pricing model, described here. For example, how much you get out of your dealings with this person depends on precisely how much you put in. So the other type of manipulation that I'm thinking about is with economic games. So economic games are basically behavioral measures to assess pro-sociality or social value orientation, such as individualism or sadism or competitivity or such things. And there are several dimensions along which you can distinguish different games. For example, the symmetry, which can be used to manipulate verticality or horizontality. And the other one is the constant sum versus non-constant sum games, which usually, if in such games, if you cooperate, then the joint income or joint wealth can increase with the amount of cooperation. So, for example, the dictator game is a fixed sum game where there are 2 roles. One decides over all the distribution of the wealth, whereas the other cannot. So it's a completely asymmetric game, whereas a prisoner's dilemma is, I think all of us know, and it's basically forces people to cooperate. What I'm also thinking about is that I can come up with any type of game if I give instructions to maximize the joint income versus to maximize the relative own income or the absolute own income. What I was also thinking about is that if there are several rounds in a game, then I could also manipulate meritocracy, because if the inequality in assets or in wealth is due to pure chance, is different than if it's due to previous performance. So what I'm thinking about is there are 2 things. One, is it possible to manipulate social norms that are usually more stable? And the other one is I haven't done a 2x2 design, and what I'm thinking about is what's how big. So how many people I need for experimenting political psychology in a 2x2 design, because what I really want to do is both doing a high versus low status manipulation or status concern and a competitive versus cooperative norm. But it's also possible to do a 1 factorial design, so only assess or measure the different narcissistic traits and manipulate the cooperative versus competitive norms. So that's it, and thank you for your attention. And
Thank you. I can open up. So I think it went really fast because you had 2 quite complex designs. Can we go back to maybe the first design
where you're proposing vignettes with horizontal and vertical manipulation. So what we see under point 1 is this the sentences that you imagine to use as manipulating the norms, or are these the measures of the outcome?
So these are actually from a questionnaire, because there is a questionnaire that this in this paper. And what I'm thinking about is telling the participants to recall a situation in their life where they were proud of being better than others, for example. So these are measures or items from a questionnaire that I could use to prime people with these to this or this.
Either vertical or horizontal.
So what I'm thinking about is either horizontal collectivist or vertical individualist, because this is the more competitive, and this is the most competitive, and this is the most cooperative or
But I think these statements are not priming them with the social norm, right? They're priming them with thinking about themselves rather than a social norm of an environment in which they operate, which is different than what I think this is different than what you want to do. So if I think about this kind of designs, maybe hypothetical paradigm, so hypothetical scenario paradigm would be better, where you actually present some kind of hypothetical communities in which particular rules apply, and then you ask, so how should this person behave, or like what do you think is the likelihood that this person will vote for, I don't know, this and that. Maybe that would be a way around it to make people imagine different social norms than they normally maybe encounter, right? That's one way to so maybe look at this paper by Daniel Nettle and Rebecca Sachs. They have this, they manipulate social norms as well there. And then the small comment about this whole thing is that, and I'm now struggling with reviews that mention that, is that, well, social norms are social. So if you have an interaction with a text or a game in which you don't necessarily think that you are being observed, or you don't have the idea of interaction that will repeat itself, that maybe you are actually not able to manipulate it in that way, right? So this is something to think about ahead of time, how you will address it. So I will open with this, and then we can come back to it.
Thank you.
We have one back there.
Thank you. I really like experiments, but yeah, for me it was also very fast. And I think I have again a conceptualization question, because it's a bit unclear for me which construct you exactly want to manipulate. Do you want to change the social norm, like the context norm? Do you want to induce a competitive mindset or a cooperative mindset within the individual? Or do you want to manipulate feelings of meritocracy, like deservingness? Because that was also the last, and for each of them, I think I would go with like a different way, right? If you think of meritocracy, there's a lot of asymmetrical economic games where one person can give more or gets more. It's very unfair. And you could manipulate if you play a game before and you deserve to be in this asymmetrical position, or if you are by luck in one. If you want to induce a cooperative or mindset, you could also have them play a game as a team before and then go into this, or a single game. So that's for me would need a bit of clarification. What is it really the social norm? Then I would also think like a hypothetical society, or like a description of the society. But if you want to manipulate something else, yeah, so that's not really helpful. But I think all of them could work depending on what you want to do.
Thank you.
Nice.
Yeah, I didn't see this presentation yet, so our supervisor is also new for me. I think it's telling that so for two people, they felt it was going too fast, and I had the same feeling, and actually no, in our first two chapters. So I wonder whether bringing in yet another dimension is going to help you produce a rounded dissertation. And so with the use of the word norm, you bring in a whole new set of concepts that you will need to grapple with. I think it would be somewhat more efficient, maybe that's the right word, to rather speak of these things in a more related to status. To interpret them as different ways to think about status threats. That way, I think it's a little bit closer to the rest of the what you've done so far. And you need to bring in less damage. Now, that's not a question, of course. I want to say something else, but that's also not a question. But I'm thinking these sort of very short one-off vignette experiments. Yeah, sometimes they work, but obviously also in here again, there will be a large file of studies in which it didn't work. So I think, first of all, think about a way to evaluate what this is actually doing, what it's supposed to do. But frankly, I would think more about a experiment with a repeated task element. So that you can collect much more data, and that is money for that. So it's also not a problem. You don't have to. But with some sort of element where we can better assess the within person. So just suggestions and questions.
Thank you. It's always
Then I have a question. There's okay. Two highs.
Oh, do you want to slide down?
Yeah, I don't know. So then what's your idea about the model? So are we trying to decrease the status threat of an individual? Is that what then we are doing when we are skipping the social norms? Okay, so that would be your, yeah, so that is closer to it, right? Maybe. Of the individual. Thanks.
Do you want to respond?
No, thank you. It's really useful.
Yeah, maybe also suggestion based on what you said is last year, when I was at Cambridge, we tried to change social norms through vignettes. And we had some hypothetical scenarios of societies that were super cooperative and super competitive. And we found that people didn't really respond well to them because these cooperative societies, people say, well, it's utopian. It doesn't really lead to an actual integration of the idea that people should be cooperative, and the competitive ones, people were just a bit repulsed by them. So that's extremely difficult. And I think that if you want to do that, that's an entire PhD. But it is possible with an iterative game to try to change at least their perceptions of the social norm in that situation.
Right.
And I think that there you can really try to do something instead of having the social norm change for the entirety of their perceptions of how social relations are, but just for that game. And I think that would be more applicable and also feasible and also more relevant for you. It's just a suggestion based on
Thank you.
that. I think it's more valuable. Yeah.
But do you have experience with behavioral games as well?
Yeah, that's easier, and also I think that's more sustainable in that iterative game, where you can also create some fake scenario where for a couple rounds people are actually playing with bots that create a certain social norm, and then you let them play with actual players and see how that social norm actually spreads. That works. Or where you have a group of people that start off with a social norm, and then one by one people go out of the group and other people come in, they keep that norm. Also, there are multiple of those games that actually work and can change social norms. So that can help, but again, it's not really a question. But
yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Of course, yeah.
I have a question. Could you go to the maybe last slide, the one with the the rivalry and vulnerability? I think further. Yeah, I was just curious if you have expectations regarding the two types of narcissism and how they would both lead to the same outcome.
So what I found so far is that the narcissistic rivalry is characterizes more the middle class people. So if I primed someone, so in the experiments on the right hand side, priming someone with higher group status or higher status amplified the association between rivalry and PR voting, and priming someone with lower class status amplified the association between vulnerability and PR voting. And in the left-hand side, what I found is that the more neurotic people are, for them, authoritarianism mediates the effect of status threat towards populist voting or PR voting, whereas for the middle class people who are more the rivalrizing, whatever, it's mostly xenophobia or nativism.
Thank you. I have a question online. It's from Haley. She says, thanks, Daniel. I have a small question about the idea to use the dictator games. Have you thought about how you would do manipulation checks with this? I'd be interested to hear how you were planning to check this, and apologies that I missed it.
Thank you. Yeah, what I was thinking about is that if I use the game as a manipulation, then I can use these items as manipulation checks, actually, from what measures the horizontality and collective individual society norms or whatever it is.
So I think one of the problems with research on popular radical right parties is that it always, well, it's very specific. Right? It's voting for this specific party. And it's difficult to generalize from this. And in addition, you have the problem that there are all kinds of things ongoing in society over which we have no control that influence the degree to which people want to vote for PRR. And so temporarily, at least, this can create ways or outcomes that PR voting is not related to certain personality types because of something they're doing, or because some other party is emerging. So I'd say ideally we want to move away from actually asking people about PRR, but to create something, an experimental equivalent of this, an outcome of a task. What would that be? Now, that's a big question.
It's a big question because in our previous experiment, we measured both parties. I mean, party support for parties or propensity to vote for parties. And for that, we got significant results. And for the hypothetical populist or nativist party, we did not.
But that doesn't work.
No.
Yeah.
But the other one did.
Yeah, sure. In this case, it worked. But I'm saying it would be better to have something that would be equivalent, but is not actually related to that specific populist party in place in time.
Yeah, I understand the question, but for me, it seems that the hypothetical version is even less valid than the real parties. But I understand what the problem is with it. So for me, like calculating an average of those parties that we consider PRR or close to PRR seem to be a more reliable measure than a more valid measure than asking about a non-existent party.
And what about attitudes towards populism, using some populism scale?
That's terrible.
Mm.
Not because of this.
So there is no such a thing as a cross-cutting populism measure. So it means if you measure one particular party, it doesn't measure actually the populism of this party. Okay, so that's a larger problem.
So I'm thinking of sort of a decision-making game where, like a dictator game or so, where the dictator can be a populist. Then at the end, you let them evaluate the dictator. And then, of course, have another dictator who's not
A populist.
a populist.
You still have to agree on what populism is then, but then you have that eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but how, so would I tell that he is a close friend of Geert Wilders or that he is a populist radical right party leader? Or how do you think that? Because here we have the same problem, right? That if I tell them that it's a hypothetical populist, that's the same problem as behavior.
question back here.
Yeah, it's very related to this because there is a lot of economic games looking at punishment institutions, and they look at whether or not this punishment is coming from one individual in the group or whether it's a democratic institution punishing, and how people change cooperative behavior in public good games due to who punishes and how. So this is something I think which might be actually quite related to what you're doing, or like a populist dictator, because what you can see is that it induces a lot of status uncertainty if people can just randomly punish each other, right? It leads like so much anti-social punishment. But also you can let people vote on in which kind of public good games they want to play. So you could create some form of not labeling it populist, but letting people vote themselves out of democracy because they're unsatisfied with some players punishing them all the time, right? So this is literature I would look into. I think it's mostly more in the behavioral games, but there has been a lot of like this, especially public good games with punishment, where they look at under different forms of punishment and who has the power and the status to give punishment. I think you could adapt that. Some testing.
Maybe not related to the games, but in general, voting for these parties is of course difficult to examine the roots of that, because that has changed over time. So before we had the small parties, and now the parties are huge, right? So also the voters for them is more like the average voter. So I think what is really interesting, before we had questions about actually voting for a populist radical right party and sympathy for a party, and people said, well, you should vote, you should focus on the actual voting variable, because that is what people really do. But now in the Netherlands, for instance, many people have voted for this party, but the party is not really maybe very sympathetic to them. It was more like a strategic vote. So we might also want to go back to the more sympathy for the party or propensity to vote for a party. That might be a better measure to get to the actual roots of the people who always vote for this party. Or you have that panel data and see, of course, to what extent they have always done it. But that is an issue we have to increasingly deal with here in the Netherlands and other countries as well.
Any other questions so far? Do you have anything you want to ask us, maybe?
Thank you very much. I got so much input, valuable input, but I think, yeah, just thank you for everyone.
Okay. Suggestion before you clap for you. I just thought about it. No, so there is this, you probably know about it, but there are these new studies that are trying to distinguish between the effect of policies and just populist rhetoric. Maybe this is something that you should look, I think Nye et al., right? This was a very recent study. And they see that actually it's not the rhetoric, it's the issues that is driving this vote. So then we are left with very little in terms of what this populism means, right? Because if it can be just a preferred policy, maybe that's what you have to manipulate in your games then. No, a system where you get different policies or outcomes from the dictator. Yeah. Sorry, that's just a tip.
Thanks.
So, good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Next week, we have a break. So we won't be having a meeting. A lot of us are at the Communication Sciences at Mo. The following week, I will actually be presenting, and so will our other PhD student, Janelle. So hopefully we can see you guys there.